Well, thank you for having me. Those of you who were here last night, there's going to be a little bit of repetition right here at the beginning, and then I'll expand it more into my dealings with PTSD. Already been introduced by Michael. Thank you, sir. So it started January 2nd, 2008. For a while, I considered that one of the worst days of my life. It was the day that I drowned. My day started out as a highly trained and experienced dive captain, dive leader, and it ended, drowned, resuscitated, transported to the hospital, released with no physical morbidity. Little did I know that there was a lot more going on in my head at that time. I'll come back to the drowning, but first I'm going to get to where it all started. My entire life, my father had told me all Swope males serve the United States through military enlistment. My youthful philosophy was, if you're going to do it, then you should do it all the way. If you're going to join the military, you join the Marine Corps, you go infantry, and you go recon. The Marine Corps put me in the infantry. They decided to make me an LAV crewman. I do not know how the Marine Corps classifies riding in an armored vehicle as an infantry specialty, but they do. And so mine is not the reason why, right? While on active duty, the Marine Corps sent me to the Water Safety Survival Instructor course. I was a strong waterman. I was selected for that course, extremely arduous course. 32 of us started, 13 of us finished. They pushed us in the water. That was the first time that I had heard and was told that everyone will panic in the water when dealing with an unplanned submersion. The time factor for that panic to occur differs greatly. For a non-swimmer, as soon as they're submerged, 1 to 2 seconds after submersion, they're going to start to panic because they know they can't swim and they're never reaching the surface again on their own accord. For an experienced waterman, for those of you who have watched the movie Chasing Mavericks, it's about a big wave surfer in Central California, and he ended up dying in the Maldives. He had an approximate 4-minute breath hold, just a phenomenal breath hold, and he was free diving in the Maldives and free diving alone, and it's theorized that he basically just went too deep. And he ended up blacking out, and then there was nobody basically to turn him over when he floated back up to the surface. I left active duty, I moved to Florida, and decided to go to school. I realized the Marine Corps is for me, but life is better as an officer than an enlisted man. I did remain in the Marine Reserves. This was my first unit in the Reserves. It was 4th Anglico. I then later took the indoctrination test for recon. It's something you have to take a test for. Basically, they judge your mental capacity for pain and suffering. And if you meet their requisite requirements, that you can withstand a lot of the things they throw at you, then you're accepted. And they sent me to the basic reconnaissance course. This was more of a fun course. As fun as the Marine Corps gets. We did a lot of patrolling in Southern California and a lot of small boat operations, amphibious work, jumping out of helicopters into the water. So for us, our brand of fun. About this time was when I met the girl who would later become my wife. Not only did I know the Marine Corps was better as an officer, I also had realized through watching many of my friends of the Marine Corps and marriage were rarely mixed, that you're either married to the Marine Corps or a woman in the Marine Corps doesn't like that competition. I chose a girl, and I ended up returning to my home in Idaho because the Boise Fire Department was hiring. And I needed a new grown-up plan since I wasn't going to make a career out of the Marine Corps. And the fire department seemed to fill those needs for adventure and excitement and pushing myself. And I did feel I could remain in the reserves, so I transferred to this Bravo Company 4th Recon Battalion. This is us participating in a NATO exercise in Norway. They sent me to the Marine Combatant Diver course. This was another extremely difficult aquatic course, and it was when I heard again that everyone will panic in the water. Only this time, we were combatant divers. We normally dive at night. We dive a rebreather in complete blackness. You have a tether line going to your buddy, and we normally dive only in 2-man teams. The most dangerous type of dive that we performed was an ice dive. It's on par with cave diving, where if a diver does have a problem, they cannot make a direct descent to the surface. As in normal scuba diving, that you have to dive, the diver has to have redundant systems, so a main bottle, a pony bottle, and other backup systems. We trained whenever we would get ice. I was the lead instructor on our ice dive training, and due to that, just about every time we had ice, I was diving it with other members of the team. So exposing myself more so than just about any of the other team members to strengthen us overall as a team. We were actually pioneering some tactics and modifying some different techniques in the world of ice diving. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, he's a psychologist, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel. He studies combat situations, crisis situations where people are making those split-second decisions, and they're making decisions under extreme duress. This is his quote, and it is very true. It's not Hollywood out there where the rescuer or the person in that crisis has the ability to make a multitude of decisions that they haven't practiced, that we sink back to that level of training. On the day in question, when I did drown, it was a routine ice dive. Everything was functioning normal, except the redundant supply valve, which is a manifold that allows us to change from our main tank to our pony tank, had been reversed for me. It was something that we had never anticipated could occur, and the lanyard that allowed you to actuate the redundant supply valve to be actuated to allow the diver, myself, to change tanks had been wrapped around the actuator. So I started breathing off my pony tank, which gave me 5 minutes of air instead of the normal hour worth of air. Once I exhausted that, I should have been able to actuate the plunger, move to the other tank, but again, it had accidentally, carelessly been disabled, and so I ran out of air. I had to remove my mask, the full face mask from my face, to access a second stage regulator that would allow me to breathe off of my pony bottle that I had already exhausted. And when I met complete resistance, that's when I knew there was a problem. Due to my training, I started to think a little bit, and that pushing myself in those situations in the pool to extend my panic threshold actually brought me a little bit of extra problem-solving time. The first thing I did was reach behind my neck to turn my tanks back on, because that was one of the things in the Marine combatant diver training that they would do. The instructors would impose problems. They would sneak down or swim down while we were in the pool, basically assault us underwater, ripping all of our gear off and turning our tanks off and ripping the regulators out of our mouth. And when they left from imposing the problem, we could solve the problem. The first thing you do is turn your tank back on. I instinctively went to that tank valve. And as I was grabbing the tank valve to turn it back on, reason shot into my head, specifying this isn't the pool, there is nobody under the ice with you turning your tanks off. So I was able to cognate that much. And then I started kind of free thinking, trying other problem-solving techniques. I first rose up to the bottom of the ice. I had settled down to the bottom, and I started finning as hard as I could, trying to find where the ice hole was that I had entered. It's extremely disorienting under the ice, which is why we're always tethered in. When I started to lose my peripheral vision at that point, and it was closing in, I thought maybe I could use line pull signals. I could pull up the slack in the line and signal the people on shore, my tender, that I had a problem. 4 tugs means an emergency, pull me in. There was so much slack in the line, though, that as I started to gather the line in, my peripheral vision was getting less and less. And due to experiencing the water safety survival instructor course, where we pushed ourselves doing a 50-meter underwater swim on a breath hold, and towards the end of that swim, often we would encounter the loss of peripheral vision and knowing that we were about to go unconscious. And I had experienced that in the pool before. So realizing that, I knew I was going unconscious. I also knew from training before and reading accounts of drownings that I did not want to aspirate water. I had read multiple accounts of persons that had drowned, aspirated water, were resuscitated, survived, and died later of a bacterial infection. And so that was in my mind also. The panic side of my brain was screaming at me to take the regulator out of my mouth, because that's what was keeping me from breathing, and to just taking a big gulp of air. I was still submerged under the ice, so the rational, the logical side of my brain knew that that regulator was keeping the water out of my lungs. So I pinched my nose and held the regulator in my mouth and just chanted, "Don't aspirate," until I lost consciousness. We anticipate that I was underwater for at least 5 minutes after I ran out, after I exhausted the pony bottle. So 5 minutes without air. My teammates realized something was wrong. I was a bit of a tyrant as a dive captain. I did not tolerate complacency, and several of the members on shore said, "Earle isn't moving, I think we need to pull him out." Other members said, "Do you realize how pissed off he's going to be if he's doing something and trying a new technique and you pull him out in the middle of it?" And one guy finally, the line tender, said, "You know, I'm going with my gut. He can be mad at me. I'm pulling him out." And so I'm very grateful to that member who did pull me out. He pulled me out. I was pulseless, apneic. They immediately pulled me out of the water, initiated CPR, cut the dry suit off of me. I was told it took 8 to 9 rescue breaths, and they had started compressions and gave me 4 to 6 chest compressions when I had a return of spontaneous circulation and started breathing again. And when I initially came out, it was absolutely terrifying. My limbs were paralyzed. I couldn't move my limbs. They wouldn't be paralyzed, but I couldn't move them. I couldn't feel anything. They loaded me in the ambulance. This is them bagging my gear. Fortunately, it's my gear going in the body bag. So I was released that evening with no physical morbidity, but I knew something was wrong. I returned to the station that night, saw my friends. There was a lot of hugging and crying because I knew I had to see them. The last time they had seen me, I was near death, so I needed to go back and see them. So I was really worried about their mental health at that time. And then I started the journey of dealing with my own mental health after that. Initially, I was undiagnosed with PTSD. I had been without air for about 5 minutes. I knew something was wrong with me. I was the dive captain, dive leader, a recon Marine. I was normally the person in control, making decisions, life and death decisions on emergency scenes. And I was feeling absolutely helplessness. For approximately 2 to 3 weeks afterwards, I received what I call chemical dumps. I don't know if it was cortisol or adrenaline. I still to this day do not know what would trigger it. There were times I would be sitting in the living room, I'd be driving in a car, and I would receive some type of massive chemical dump where I would feel jittery. And I had experienced, due to the Marine Corps and the fire department, numerous adrenaline dumps throughout my career. I knew what that experience was. My heart would race. That would then induce a panic attack, which I had never experienced before. And knowing a panic attack was coming on, there was still nothing I could do about it other than try and slow my breathing. I knew the techniques, how to overcome a panic attack. This caused me to think that I was absolutely losing my mind. I've since also learned that a severe psychological trauma results in actual physical brain trauma. I was attending a conference 3-4 years ago. A psychologist was speaking, and that's when she stated that your brain actually suffers a physical injury from a psychological event. That did wonders for me, helping explain what I had been going through over the years. I've been on this 14-year journey trying to understand what occurred to me, but then also share that with other people. The other thing, this psychologist, who's absolutely brilliant, I've maintained a relationship with her, and in one of our correspondences, she came up with what I think is a wonderful theory about what occurred to me, due to the fact that diving is an extremely kinesthetic experience. There's the water pressure, there's the temperature differential, wearing the dry suit, being squeezed, floating in a three-dimensional environment, everything that is different than how we live in air. Sound travels differently, heat transfer is different. And she specified, she said, how odd it must be for your brain for that psychological trauma to occur in that kinesthetic experience, and now your brain's trying to process and make sense of it out of the water. And I thought that's a phenomenal theory, and probably had something to do with why I couldn't explain when those chemical dumps would occur. And they started frequently for the first couple days and tapered off and ended after approximately 3 weeks. I was extremely emotional during this. I had numerous friends, tough firefighters that came to my house, and they would show up, and I would just have tears running down my cheeks because I was so overwhelmed that they were being so thoughtful to see me. And they were just coming because they were worried about me. I would know I was making them uncomfortable, I'd apologize, and there was nothing I could do about it. It was just this extreme emotional release. I couldn't make decisions. I remember going to one of our stores. I thought maybe I'll get some calming tea. And I stood in the tea aisle for about 30 minutes and finally went home because I couldn't decide what type of tea to get. I had severe mood swings. I was so joyful and happy at being alive and grateful that I had survived, grateful that my teammates had pulled me out and that they had trained so hard, and it wouldn't take anything to set me off, and I would be in despair, I would be sad, I would be angry, and a nice car would drive by and I would be grateful again. And just this crazy roller coaster of mood swings and emotions. And even though I had this wonderful support system, family and friends and my fellow firefighters, other police officers, many of the emergency services and first responders that I worked with that were constantly calling me, I had this feeling that I was absolutely and utterly alone. And that no person in the history of the world had ever experienced what I had. And regardless of what I did, regardless of what friends said, I just could not get out of that. So for the treatment, the department had no plan whatsoever for a severe psychological event. There was nothing. Adding to that aloneness and some frustration was that we had had significant psychological trauma in the past. And that also helped generate some of my anger at that point. When I recognized that we had had this problem in the past, a friend of mine had suffered a traumatic brain injury on the job about 6 years prior. The department had given him time off and told him to go fix himself. 6 years later, I had suffered this event, and it was the same treatment. I was given time off and told to go fix myself. Fortunately, several of my colleagues, other firefighters, knew of a psychologist. I went to go see her. She validated the fact that I was experiencing all of this. And she said if I wasn't feeling this way, there would be something wrong, that I should be experiencing everything I was going through. And she helped me. She brought my wife in and helped us try and work through things. She did never, though, diagnose me with PTSD at that time, which I think might have helped a bit more. While seeing her at the time in the state of Idaho, mental health was not recognized for work, for legal means, And so a psychologist could not handle my off-duty case, or my case for workers' compensation. And a medical doctor had to see it. I would go see her, then I would have to go see the medical doctor, and I would confide in him the same things I had told her, which she had validated, and he would tell me that I shouldn't be feeling that way. And so he would undermine what she had done, which created even more frustration, anger on my part, and didn't help things. I received almost too much brotherly love from my fellow firefighters. I would relive this 7 to 10 times a day as they would stop by the house out of consideration for me, asking what had happened, asking what they could do, and I would repeat it over and over and over. So I was never getting a break from this. And they were genuinely concerned. They were doing what they thought was helpful. And fortunately, my wife finally said, "This is enough. You're reliving it every day." And she's originally from Florida, and so we flew back to Florida, got a place on the beach where I could just think and try and process some of what was going on without my concerned friends and brothers loving me too much. The first year it was extremely difficult. The second year wasn't much better, and it slowly tapered off till about year 7. Some of the missed options I had were EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, where psychologists use various techniques. It could be lights, it could be buzzers held in your hands, and they try and get, and this is in my layman's interpretation, get the two sides of your brains making sense, reconciling the information that has not been stored, has not been filed properly, which results in post-traumatic stress disorder. That information kind of gets frozen and it doesn't get compartmentalized the way that it should, causing the individual to relive the events and deal with PTSD. I saw a few counselors, but they didn't really take for me, and that's one of the things that I've learned over time, is if you don't find a counselor that works for you, to continue looking. And especially with the emergency services, it could take a while to find somebody who can relate to that person who deals with a lot more trauma than the everyday individual. More exercise, I could have done a lot more exercise. I was playing hockey at the time, but a lot more exercise would have helped. Not knowing what else to do, I turned to alcohol and drank it away, which again just exacerbated a lot of the things that I dealt with. Along this journey, I've learned about resiliency and personal resilience. I didn't know it was a thing at the time. In my 20s, in the Marine Corps, extremely masculine profession, I bounced back from anything. Resilience wasn't a thing. If you couldn't do it, then you got out, or you left the unit. Same thing initially in the fire department. If you couldn't do it, then leave the fire service. It's not quite that simple. There's a lot of trauma that occurs to us throughout our career. And it does get a little touchy-feely. It's the human resources stuff, it's psychologists, and it's not necessarily in that masculine vocabulary, but it needs to enter that vocabulary and that discourse. It's kind of a traditional wellness wheel that all of us deal with, and it doesn't matter what the profession, but especially for first responders, these are all equally important criteria. This is my wellness wheel on January 2nd. In hindsight, I've realized I was probably at my lowest point of resilience in my entire life. Financially, our daughter was 3.5 years old at the time. We decided that my wife would not work while we had our daughter, and she would go back to work when she went back to school. So we did the American thing. We continued to spend like we had 2 incomes, and we just racked it all up on credit cards. And when she went back to work, then we would pay everything off. And then we had my son, who was 6 months old at the time. And so now we're at this financial crisis point, and that's adding a lot of stress. The emotional part, I had a 6-month-old at home, I had a 3.5-year-old daughter at home. My wife was still postpartum, and I think we don't talk about it enough that dads can be postpartum too. And dealing with all of that at home, and then the emotional aspect of the drowning. The environmental part, I just chalked that up. That was the drowning itself. Occupationally, I was a dive captain. We had a new special operations chief. I had trained this individual to dive approximately 3 years earlier. He became special operations chief and decided now he had learned everything there was to know about dive rescue, even though I was the one that had trained him. So he was telling me what tactics we needed to use, what equipment we needed to purchase, how we needed to train, some of which was regressing the dive team. And so dealing with him was almost a constant battle at work, me trying to fight him actually regressing our dive team. Generated a lot of stress. I was also on one of our 2 downtown companies, engine companies, so we ran more calls than most of the rest of the companies in the city. Physically, due to the children, everything else, the workload of a downtown captain, I wasn't exercising as much as I had been in the past. And so in this journey, like I said, I discovered about resilience. And I love this quote. This is Dr. Seuss, and it's that core strength that we use to lift the load of life. And as I've learned, the longer you live, the more chunks life takes out of you, and it just gets heavier. And these are the 5 things that he really emphasizes to help build resilience in an individual. For myself, I'm not an expert, but one of the things I've discovered is it starts with awareness and just knowing that resilience is a thing. It's constant self-improvement. I equate it to going to the gym for your mind and trying to keep your mind as healthy as possible. There are so many sources out there, and I've sifted through quite a few. I see a counselor once every 6 to 8 weeks now, and that's fantastic for me, and she helps guide me through all of these sources because that's her profession. I use the analogy for years. I've used an accountant who saves me a lot of money rather than do my taxes myself because that's her job, and she's a professional in that. When I meet a new firefighter who does their own taxes, I normally call him an idiot or talk to him in some sense, and they'll normally get offended. But then I bring up the point that if you were responded to an accountant's place of business, she was trying to extinguish a structure fire with a garden hose, you'd push her out of the way and say, let me do my job and save all your files and your business. And it's the same thing with a counselor. I can read everything, I can attend conferences, but it's really that person who's a professional who can point me in the right direction to help out myself. And they're much better at unpacking my brain than I am myself often, at least in relation to psychological events. Dealing with first responders and professional rescuers, what we see and do isn't normal. And this speaks more to that cumulative trauma than the acute trauma, psychological trauma I experienced. In Boise, Idaho, as firefighters and EMTs, we encounter at least one dead person a month, and not in the mortuary type of setting. We see death in its most gruesome forms possible, and then we're normally handling and manipulating those people either prior to death or after death. That leads to hundreds and hundreds of dead people we come in contact in a career. The average person normally sees 2, 3, 4 people, and that's in a mortuary setting, or it's something that they expect to encounter, finding a parent, somebody that they might expect to come in contact with. The psychosocial trauma that first responders deal with, again, is not normal. in America, the average American has 3 to 4 significant psychologically traumatic events in their entire lifetime. Firefighters and first responders have 3 to 4 a year. So over a 25-year career, we have 75 to 100 significant psychological traumatic events. The average person has 3 to 4. We're woken in the middle of the night to bells, that sleep deprivation, interruption of sleep. We come in contact with injured people, suffering people. That all takes a toll, even though we're helping them. And that makes us feel good. We're still dealing with them while they're suffering, while their family members are suffering. An occupational injury, I've been burned twice, suffered numerous other injuries, I've been drowned. I can relate to Rasputin a little bit, but there's no one I know in the fire service who makes it through a career uninjured. And then we're placed in scary, life-threatening situations. This is one where, due to what I've experienced, I've kind of extrapolated it into this next bit, and it's more for those in the emergency services. And the emergency services are a traditional manner of dealing with significant high-risk events is we have a risk-benefit factor. We'll risk a lot to save a lot. So to save a life, we'll risk our life. And that's our traditional model, and normally it's pretty linear. One of the things I've discovered through all of this is that resilience really needs to be on par with that risk, with the potential risk level. In the fire service, our battalion chiefs have their go-to captains, and then they also have their captains and crews that might not be as well trained or experienced as their go-to captains. They will place that go-to captain, the highly experienced, highly trained captain and crew, in situations that they might not place somebody else, and especially for a higher level of reward. What we often forget is that level of resilience isn't there. For me, I was on that day, January 2nd, I was highly trained, I was highly experienced, and my resilience was at an all-time low. And a lot of that is due to my ignorance, to resilience at the time. Some of the things that allow us to define our operational capability or those other aspects are training, our occupational wisdom, all the calls that we went on, our equipment, and our personnel, their actual aptitude. How good of a person not how good of a person are they, how capable are they? Their leadership and all of this affects the operational capability. And so that then, I think, expands that risk-benefit, where not only is it the risk for that benefit, but it's also the aptitude of the rescuer needs to be on par with that resilience. And this, again, is just a reiteration of what I was just talking about, but even with that increased resilience, that psychosocial trauma can still occur. A person could be extremely resilient, but if they go on a firefighter, first responder goes on a call, and there's a child who's the same age of their child at home, that can significantly affect them and impact them. It becomes personal. So those need to be mitigated, even if they have that higher level of resilience. I've been a member of our peer support team since its inception about 8 years ago. We've discovered that we can take engine companies out of service if the crews are having a tough time, bring peer support teams in and just try and discuss that as close to the incident as possible. If that doesn't work, then counseling, seeing a psychologist, potential EMDR, but trying to stay on top of that psychosocial trauma and figure out how to take care of those first responders. I'm almost 14 years into dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. The incident doesn't affect me anymore, although about 16 years ago, in 2016, a few years ago, I started to have issues when I was at work that we wear a full face mask. It's an SCBA, self-contained breathing apparatus mask, when we go in fires, so that we can breathe off the air bottle on our back. During a period of training where we're exerting ourselves physically, I started to have a little bit of a panic attack. And I believe what it was my mind equated the mask on my face, exerting myself physically, back to the drowning event. Well, that had occurred in 2008. I had not had a problem wearing the SCBA mask until 2016. And it wasn't until about a month ago, preparing for this very lecture, that I realized the significance. My youngest son, who's 8 now, was born with missing a left ventricle and had to undergo 3 open heart surgeries at 5 days old, 6 months old, and the last one was at 3.5 years old. That was in 2016. So he had to undergo his 3rd open heart surgery, and when I returned to work several months later is when I started having difficulties with wearing my SCBA mask. And so not being a psychologist or a counselor, however that worked, it triggered something in me. And like I said, I had not correlated those until I was preparing for this very lecture, and I realized the significance of that timeline. I was able to overcome that panic attack, but it reoccurred several times during training, a few times during structure fires. And that can be very disconcerting when you're a captain on the interior, directing combat operations in a structure fire, giving briefings to your battalion chief outside, and then having to talk down a panic attack on top of that it makes it even that much more difficult. And as I put in here, Dory knows my kids love Finding Nemo, and a lot of this is just to keep on swimming. And that was one of the things after starting to experience those panic attacks, was not only did I just keep swimming and moving forward, but I returned to the pool due to that oxygen deprivation that you get while you're swimming, and working at physically reconditioning myself, and especially psychologically reconditioning my mind to working at being without air while swimming, or without air for those brief moments, and that helped me to better overcome that psychological problem that I was having with the SCBA mask. What I've discovered with wellness and resiliency over the years is that it requires constant effort at working on yourself to be your happiest self. I ended up reading a book, and the author specified, find that which brings you joy, which just sounds really, really lame, right? And it should be obvious. I wasn't necessarily always doing that. I was more concerned with what I needed to do as a firefighter, as a captain, as a father, and sometimes you just need to break away and experience joy. So I started skiing and riding dirt bikes more. Serving with compassion is something that I think first responders, emergency workers need to constantly focus on. I've known too many individuals that become jaded later in their career, and always remember to serve with compassion. And that practice of self-awareness and character building builds that resiliency. Finding out what your purpose and what gives you meaning, that's one of the things that really rocked my world when I drowned. Is I thought that I had failed because I had been operating at a high level as a Marine, as an instructor, and then I drowned, and I was no longer the go-to person. I ended up leaving the dive team approximately a year after my drowning, and to fill that void, I discovered in the interim that I really enjoyed art and the arts, and I started practicing as an artist, returned to school, and accomplished my Master of Fine Arts. For the first responders out there, if there are any that are starting to get jaded, is to go back and think about what you first loved about that job. For me, I remember when I tested to become a firefighter, there was a fire engine sitting in the maintenance bay, and one of the captains there said, "Hey, why don't you climb up and sit in it?" And I just sat in this cavernous, huge fire engine, and with all the switches, and at that time I was a recon Marine, but I still thought, wow, this is where the heroes sit. And so there would be that time during my career, after my drowning, that I would have to remember what it was that I first loved about this job. I've read a book a couple of years ago about Benjamin Franklin, and when he was 20 years old, he wrote down 13 character traits that he tried to work on every day for the rest of his life. And that's what made him Benjamin Franklin. I'm no Benjamin Franklin, so I just have 3 traits that I try and work on, and I fail at them on a regular basis. And that's gratitude, tolerance, and humility for myself. And again, I don't get to them every day. I fail often, but I try and keep those at the forefront of my mind. One of the things that I have also done is I maintain an art journal where I'll sketch, I'll draw, I'll write, but then I go back and I reread that periodically, and it helps between counseling, working on building my resilience, looking into my art journal. It helps keep my life and my character in view. So I'd just like to thank you for having me here today and hope that you all live well.